My wife left me for another man. She took my own family to their wedding abroad. She texted me, "Don't be home when we get back. Once it's old, it's dead to me." They all returned and saw what I had done. Their smiles vanished. They looked at the empty land and asked each other one terrified question. I just watched from my car and smiled. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The bandsaw hummed its familiar tune, a low mechanical growl that had become as natural to Michael Halden as his own breathing. Sawdust hung in the air of the workshop, caught in the afternoon light that slanted through the single window facing west. The particles drifted like snow that would never settle, suspended in a world that felt increasingly unreal. Michael ran his thumb along the edge of the walnut board he'd been shaping for the past hour. His father's chisel lay beside it, the handle worn smooth from decades of use. The tool still fit his hand the way it had fit his father's, perfectly, like it had been waiting for someone who understood the language of wood and patience. The phone buzzed against the workbench. He didn't reach for it immediately. There was something in that vibration, some quality to the way it rattled against the old pine surface, that made his gut tighten. Michael had learned long ago to trust those gut feelings, the ones that arrived before conscious thought, the ones that came from some ancient part of the brain that still remembered when hesitation meant survival. He set down the chisel with deliberate care, aligned it precisely with the others hanging on the pegboard his father had installed 40 years ago. Everything in its place. Everything ordered. That's how you build a life that lasted, one careful decision at a time, one board fitted perfectly to the next. The phone buzzed again. Michael picked it up, the screen casting a cold glow across his face. The workshop suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as he read the words that appeared on the screen. "Don't be home when we get back. Once it's old, it's dead to me." The message came from a number he knew better than his own. Amelia, his wife of 19 years. Correction, his soon-to-be ex-wife, though she hadn't bothered with the paperwork yet. Why would she? She'd been too busy planning a wedding to someone else. Michael's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching beneath the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave in 3 days. He read the message again, then a third time, as if repetition might somehow change the words or reveal some hidden meaning he'd missed. But there was no hidden meaning. Amelia had never been subtle. It was one of the things he'd initially found refreshing about her directness, her clarity. He'd mistaken cruelty for honesty back then. He set the phone down slowly, his hand steady. Years of marriage to Amelia Beringer. She'd already taken that last name. He'd seen it on social media, had taught him one essential survival skill. Never show weakness. Never give her the satisfaction of seeing him crack. She collected broken things the way some people collected stamps, displayed them to her friends as evidence of her own strength. The workshop was silent now, except for the distant sound of wind moving through the pines outside. Michael stood and walked to the window, looking out at the house he'd built with his own hands. Every board, every nail, every carefully measured angle. 15 years of his life existed in that structure. Encoded in wood and stone and the sweat that had poured off him during the summer, he'd framed the roof alone because he couldn't afford to hire help. Once it's old, it's dead to me. He pulled up his phone again, navigating to the social media apps he rarely used. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. The photos were everywhere, posted with gleeful frequency by people who should have known better. His sister Lena, grinning beside Amelia in a bridesmaid dress the color of champagne. The caption read, "So happy to celebrate love today." 342 likes. His cousin Harold, arm around Tate Beringer's shoulder, both of them holding drinks with tiny umbrellas. Best destination wedding ever. Hashtag Santorini, hashtag brotherhood. His mother, his own mother, in the front row of the ceremony, tears streaming down her face as Amelia walked down an aisle scattered with rose petals toward a man she'd known for 8 months. Michael saved each photo methodically, creating a new folder on his phone titled Simply Evidence. Not because he planned to use them in divorce proceedings. He was past that kind of thinking now. But because he needed to remember. Memory could be slippery, could soften the edges of betrayal until it looked almost forgivable. These photos would serve as a permanent record, a reminder that some bridges didn't just burn, they were demolished with carefully placed charges by people you trusted to help you build them. He scrolled further back, finding the engagement announcement from 6 months ago. Amelia and Tate on a beach at sunset, her hand extended toward the camera to show off a ring that probably cost more than Michael made in 3 months. Tate was 33, a motivational speaker who sold confidence to desperate people through YouTube videos and online courses. His most popular video, with 2.3 million views, was titled, "How to Become the Man You Were Meant to Be." Michael had watched it once, sitting in this same workshop while Amelia was supposedly at her book club. He made it 7 minutes before turning it off. The entire video was just borrowed phrases strung together with dramatic pauses, other people's wisdom repackaged as original thought. But it worked. Thousands of comments praised Tate's insight, his authenticity, his life-changing advice. Amelia had fallen for it completely. Or maybe she'd fallen for what Tate represented. Youth, excitement, the promise of adventure. Michael was 47, steady as a foundation, reliable as sunrise. He'd spent his life building things that lasted, but somewhere along the way, lasting had become boring. He moved through the workshop, turning off lights, unplugging tools. The space smelled of sawdust and machine oil, scents that had become inseparable from his sense of self. This had been his sanctuary, the place he came to think, to create, to remember his father. The walls were covered with his father's tools, each one hanging on its designated hook. His father, Robert Halden, had been a carpenter by trade and a builder by nature. He'd taught Michael everything. Not just how to measure twice and cut once, but how to read with grain, how to sense the integrity of a structure before stress tests confirmed it, how to build something that would outlast the builder. "Never let someone tell you what you're worth," his father had said near the end, his voice weakened by the cancer eating through his lungs. "Show them." Michael locked the workshop door behind him and walked toward the house. The gravel crunched under his boots, each step deliberate. The house rose before him, 2 stories of craftsman-style architecture with a wraparound porch and dormers he designed himself. Amelia used to bring friends by for tours, showing off the vaulted ceilings and exposed beams, the custom kitchen with its butcher block counters, the master bathroom with its rainfall shower and heated floors. "My beautiful house," she'd say, gesturing expansively. She never mentioned who'd built it. Visitors assumed they'd hired some expensive contractor, and Amelia never corrected them. Michael climbed the porch steps, noting the slight give in the third board that he'd been meaning to replace. He'd replace it tonight, he decided. Not for Amelia, never again for Amelia, but because unfinished work offended something deep in his nature. Inside, the house felt cavernous and empty despite being full of furniture and possessions. Amelia's taste dominated every room. Minimalist decor, neutral colors, carefully curated pieces that looked expensive whether they were or not. Michael's contributions were invisible, hidden in the bones of the structure itself. The support beams he'd sister-jointed for maximum load distribution. The foundation he'd poured in sections to account for seasonal soil movement. The insulation he'd upgraded twice to keep their heating bills manageable. He walked through the living room, running his hand along the mantel he'd carved from a single piece of cherry wood. Amelia had covered it with photographs in matching silver frames. Most of them featured her. Amelia at various stages of life, Amelia with friends, Amelia on trips Michael had paid for but rarely appeared in. There was one photo of them together from their wedding day. He was smiling in it, genuinely happy, too young at 28 to understand that happiness without vigilance was just another word for naivete. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee he'd made that morning. He'd stood at this counter, drinking from the chipped mug his father had given him, and read the text that Amelia had sent the day before. "You know this isn't working. I need more than you can give." He'd known what that meant. She'd been spending more time on her phone, more nights out with friends, more weekends away at wellness retreats. Michael had chosen to ignore the signs, not out of stupidity, but out of a kind of stubborn hope that if he just kept building, kept providing, kept being reliable, she'd remember why she'd chosen him in the first place. But Amelia didn't want reliable. She wanted excitement that didn't require effort, adventure that came without risk, transformation that demanded no real change. Tate Beringer sold all of that in neat 30-minute packages with cinematic B-roll and inspirational music. Michael walked upstairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. The master bedroom looked like something from a magazine spread. White bedding, tasteful art, a statement chair in the corner that no one ever sat in. He'd built the bed frame himself, mortise and tenon joints that would last a century. Amelia had covered it with decorative pillows that served no function except to be removed every night and replaced every morning. He sat on the edge of the bed, the frame solid beneath his weight. No creaking, no give. Perfect construction. But perfect construction didn't matter when the person sleeping beside you was already gone, already building a new life in someone else's blueprint. The betrayal wasn't just Amelia's. That would have been manageable, survivable. People fell out of love. Marriages ended. He'd seen it happen to friends, watched them navigate the aftermath with varying degrees of grace and bitterness. But Amelia had taken his family with her. Lena, his younger sister by 3 years, who'd called him crying when her husband left, who'd stayed in his guest room for 2 months while she put her life back together. He'd co-signed her car loan when no bank would trust her credit. He'd helped her move 4 times. And when Amelia had announced she was leaving him for Tate, Lena had said, maybe you should think about why she needs to find happiness elsewhere. Harold, his cousin, who'd borrowed $15,000 to start a failed business and never paid back a cent Michael had written it off, told him not to worry about it. Family came first. Harold had repaid that generosity by posting Instagram stories from Santorini with hashtags like #TeamLove and #NewBeginnings. And his mother, that was the one that had hollowed him out, left him staring at walls in the middle of the night, trying to understand how the woman who'd given birth to him could sit in the front row and cry happy tears while his marriage was publicly cremated and scattered over the Aegean Sea. He'd called her once, 2 weeks before the wedding, hoping for explanation or at least acknowledgement. It's complicated, Michael, she'd said, her voice tight with discomfort. Amelia's been very good to me. She helped me set up my computer, drove me to appointments when my car was in the shop. And Tate seems like a very nice young man. I'm your son. I know that. But I can care about Amelia too. This doesn't have to be about taking sides. Except it was entirely about taking sides, and they'd all chosen the same one, the one that wasn't him. Michael stood, pulling the phone from his pocket again. He opened the photos once more, studying each face. Not with anger anymore, but with something colder, more clinical. He was seeing them clearly now, seeing them the way an engineer sees a structure with hidden flaws, weak points that haven't failed yet but will, inevitably, under the right pressure. They made their choice. Now he'd make his. He walked to the window, looking out over the property. 3 acres of pine and oak, the land sloping gently down toward Cedar Lake. His father had bought this plot 40 years ago for almost nothing, back when Cedar Lake was just a forgotten pocket of North Carolina that no one wanted. He'd built a small cabin here, spent weekends teaching Michael how to fish, how to identify trees by their bark, how to find north without a compass. When his father died, he'd left the land solely to Michael. Not to be divided, not to be sold. Michael's, free and clear. The house had come later, built during the early years of his marriage when he'd still believed in permanence. Once it's old, it's dead to me. Michael turned away from the window, a plan forming in his mind with the same clarity that came when he drafted blueprints. He could see it all at once. The whole structure, every supporting element, every stress point, every connection that made it work. He wouldn't destroy Amelia. He wouldn't have to. He'd simply remove the foundation she'd been standing on. Let gravity and consequence do the rest. But first, he needed to see the lake. The drive to Cedar Lake took 12 minutes. Long enough for Michael to watch the sky turn from late afternoon gold to dusk purple. The roads out here were still gravel and dirt, maintained just enough to keep trucks from bottoming out in the spring mud. Amelia had always hated these roads, complained they were uncivilized, too rural, too far from anything that mattered. Michael loved them. He parked near the public pier, A weathered structure that jutted 50 feet into water, so still it looked like dark glass. No one else was here. Mid-October in North Carolina meant the summer tourists were gone, and it was too early for the few hardy-eyed fishermen who'd show up in December. Michael walked out onto the pier, his boots hollow against the wood. The boards were old but solid. He'd helped replace them 5 years ago when the town council finally allocated funds for repairs. He'd done the work for free, recognizing it as one of those maintenance projects that would never get done right if left to the lowest bidder. He sat on the edge, legs dangling over the water. The lake reflected what was left of the sunset, pink and orange bleeding into deep blue. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, its sound lonely and ancient. His father had brought him here the summer he turned 12. They'd sat on this same pier, fishing rods between them, not talking much because his father had understood that silence could be companionship too. "What do you want to be?" his father had asked eventually, the question coming out of nowhere the way his father's questions often did. "I don't know. Maybe a builder like you." His father had nodded, reeling in his line to check the bait. "Building's good. Honest work. But I'm not asking what you want to do. I'm asking what you want to be." Michael had thought about that, watching his bobber drift on the current. "I want to be someone people can count on." His father had smiled, one of those rare, full smiles that made his whole face different. "That's a good thing to be. But here's what I learned. You can be that person, reliable and steady and always there when people need you. But you can't let them mistake that for weakness. The strongest trees are the ones that bend in the wind, but they don't break. You bend when you need to, but you never, ever break. How do you know when you're breaking? You'll feel it. Right here." His father had tapped his chest, over his heart. "You'll feel something crack that used to be whole. When that happens, you have two choices. You can let it shatter completely, or you can remove yourself from whatever's doing the breaking. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away." Michael hadn't understood then. He'd been 12, still young enough to believe that if you were good enough, kind enough, reliable enough, people would value that. It had taken him 35 more years to learn what his father already knew, that kindness without boundaries was just another invitation for exploitation. The loon called again, closer now. Michael watched it glide across the water, perfectly at home in its element. He thought about the house, about the 15 years he'd poured into it. Every weekend, every spare hour, every careful decision about placement and materials and design. He'd built it to last, built it to weather storms and time and the 1,000 small stresses that broke lesser structures. But a house was only as good as the land beneath it. And the land had always been his. Michael pulled out his phone, scrolling through his photos until he found the deed his father had signed over to him 2 months before the cancer finally won. The document was clear. The land was transferred to Michael Robert Halden, in full, with no encumbrances, no liens, no joint ownership. His father had been specific about that, had insisted Michael understand the importance of owning the ground beneath his feet. "A man who owns his land owns his future," his father had said. Remember that. The house mortgage was in both their names, his and Amelia's. They'd bought it together, or rather, they'd bought the construction materials together while Michael provided the labor. But the land itself, the 3 acres that held everything, had never been part of that equation. Amelia's name appeared nowhere on the land deed. Legally, technically, the house was sitting on his property without his permission. And permission, once given, could be revoked. Michael stood, the plans settling into place with the weight of inevitability. He wasn't going to fight Amelia in court. He wasn't going to beg his family to choose sides. He wasn't going to compete with Tate Beringer's hollow confidence and borrowed wisdom. He was going to do what he'd always done best, solve the problem at its foundation. The night, air was getting cold, carrying the smell of pine and lake water. Michael walked back to his truck, each step deliberate, each breath measured. By the time he reached the driver's seat, he knew exactly what had to happen. Amelia wanted him gone when she returned. He'd be gone, but so would everything else. Michael started before dawn, when the world was still dark and Cedar Lake was holding its breath between night and morning. The workshop lights came on at 4:47 a.m., earlier than his usual 5:30 start time, but today wasn't usual. He made a list first. The way he made lists for every project, methodical, organized, nothing left to chance. The paper was divided into 3 columns: keep, dispose, and strategize. He wrote in pencil, his father's mechanical pencil that still had the same lead refill from 15 years ago, the lines neat and precise. In the keep column went everything that belonged to him alone. His father's tools, every single one. The blueprints he'd drawn for various projects over the years, kept in a weather-tight cabinet. Photo albums from his childhood, the ones his mother had given him before she'd apparently decided he was disposable. His grandfather's pocket watch, the fishing rods from the pier, books, his clothes, a dozen small things that added up to a life lived before Amelia, separate from Amelia. The dispose column was shorter. Trash he'd accumulated, old receipts, worn-out work boots, broken equipment he'd been meaning to fix. Nothing important, nothing worth keeping. The strategize column was the longest and the most interesting. Michael stood in the kitchen as sunrise began painting the sky orange, drinking coffee from his father's chipped mug. The house felt different now. Not like home, but like a problem to be solved. He designed it, built it, knew every beam and joist and stress point. He knew where the structure was strongest and where it was most vulnerable. He knew the composition of the soil beneath the foundation, how it shifted with rain and season. He knew because he'd tested it all himself, had over-engineered every element, because that was how his father had taught him to work. If you're going to build something, his father had said, build it to survive the worst day it'll ever see, then double that. Michael had followed that advice religiously. The house was built to withstand 100-year floods, Category 3 hurricane winds, and the soil erosion that happened in this part of North Carolina. It was beautiful and strong and would probably stand for a century, unless someone who understood its construction decided otherwise. He walked through each room, coffee in hand, seeing the structure beneath the surface. The load-bearing walls were obvious to him, even though they looked identical to the decorative ones. The support beams running through the walls and under the floors formed a network he could picture in 3 dimensions, the way most people picture their own faces. The foundation poured in sections, each section tied to the next with rebar and carefully formulated concrete designed to flex with the soil movement. In a master bedroom, he opened the closet that Amelia had claimed as hers. Her side was empty. She'd taken everything to Santorini, apparently planning to start fresh when she returned with her new husband. His side still held his work clothes, his winter jacket, the spare tool belt he kept for projects. He pushed aside the hanging clothes, revealing the back wall of the closet. Most people would see just drywall, but Michael saw the small access panel he'd installed during construction. It was barely visible, the seams tight, the paint matched perfectly. He'd put it there for practical reasons. Access to plumbing and electrical without having to tear apart walls. Michael opened the panel, reaching into the space between the studs. His hand found the small fireproof safe he'd mounted there, hidden and forgotten even by him most days. He pulled it out, heavy and cold, and carried it to the bed. The combination was his father's birthday, a number he'd never forget. The safe opened with a solid click, revealing the documents inside. Social security cards, birth certificates, insurance papers, and beneath all of that, a manila envelope he'd filed away and hadn't thought about in years. The deed. Not the deed to the house. That one was in a filing cabinet downstairs. The mortgage still active, the balance being paid down slowly by his steady paychecks. This was different. Michael pulled out the document, unfolding it carefully. The paper was thick, official, bearing the seal of the Randolph County Register of Deeds. It was dated March 15th, 9 years ago, 2 months before his father died. Land deed transfer, 3.2 acres, Cedar Lake, North Carolina. From Robert James Halden to Michael Robert Halden. Transfer type, gift. Conditions, none. Michael read it twice, then a third time, each pass making something settle deeper in his chest. He'd known the land was his. His father had told him that much before he died. But seeing it in legal terms, seeing the absolute nature of the transfer, the complete absence of Amelia's name anywhere on the document, that changed something. The house was jointly owned, true. The mortgage was a shared debt. But the land beneath it? That was his alone. And in North Carolina, you couldn't maintain a structure on someone else's land without their explicit permission. The law was clear about that. Property rights extended from the earth to the sky and everything in between. If the landowner revoked permission, the structure either had to be moved or removed. Michael sat on the bed, the deed in his hands, understanding flowing through him like cold water. This wasn't just a betrayal Amelia would recover from with therapy and time. This was a complete reordering of the power structure she'd assumed existed. She thought she'd left him with nothing, taken everything that mattered, his family, his dignity, his future. She'd gone to Greece to marry another man, posted the photos online for everyone to see, sent him a message telling him to be gone when she returned. But she'd miscalculated. She'd assumed the house was equally theirs because the mortgage papers said so. She'd probably already consulted a lawyer, probably already had plans for how the divorce would split the assets. The house would be sold, proceeds divided. She'd walk away with half of everything he'd built. Except you couldn't sell a house without owning the land it sat on. Michael stood, carefully folding the deed and putting it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart where he could feel its weight. He walked downstairs, through the living room with Amelia's curated aesthetic, through the kitchen with its custom cabinets, out onto the back porch where he could see the whole property. The land sloped gently toward the lake, covered with pine trees and oak, their leaves starting to turn gold and red. This was his father's land, passed to him, held in trust for whatever future he chose to build. His father had seen something in Michael that Michael was only now beginning to see in himself. A kind of quiet strength that didn't announce itself, but didn't bend either. The strongest trees bend in the wind, but they don't break. Michael wasn't breaking. He was recalibrating. He pulled out his phone and searched for the Randolph County office hours. They open at 8. He'd be there when the doors unlocked. The Randolph County Land Records office was a squat brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and never updated. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and office coffee, the kind of smell that settles into government buildings and never quite leaves. A single clerk sat behind a plexiglass window, pecking at a keyboard with 2 fingers. Michael waited his turn, standing behind a woman arguing about property taxes, her voice rising in that particular pitch of someone who knows they're wrong, but has committed to the argument anyway. The clerk handled her with practiced patience, explaining the same thing 3 different ways until the woman finally left, muttering about government incompetence. Next, the clerk called, not looking up. Michael stepped to the window. "I need to file a land use notification." Now the clerk looked up, slightly more interested. She was maybe 60, with reading glasses on a chain and the resigned expression of someone who'd worked the same job for 30 years. "What kind of notification?" "I own a piece of property on Cedar Lake. There's a structure on it that I need to have removed." The clerk pulled out a form, sliding it under the plexiglass. "You'll need to fill this out. If there's a mortgage on the structure, you'll need to notify the mortgage holder. If there are other owners, they need to sign off too. If the structure has been there more than 7 years, you might need a demolition permit, depending on size and type." Michael took the form, scanning it quickly. It was simpler than he'd expected, almost disappointingly bureaucratic in its straightforwardness. The structure is residential. The mortgage holder is First National Bank. I'm the sole owner of the land. What's the timeline on something like this? Once filed, there's a 30-day notice period for any interested parties to contest. If no one contests, the land use reverts to landowner control, and existing structures need to be removed or relocated within 90 days. And if someone contests, then it goes to county arbitration. But that's rare. Landowner rights are pretty absolute in North Carolina. As long as you own the land free and clear, you get to decide what goes on it. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "This is about a divorce, isn't it?" Michael met her eyes, keeping his face neutral. "It's about property rights." She nodded slowly. "Uh-huh. Well, property rights it is. Fill out the form, bring it back with a copy of your land deed, and we'll file it. 30-day notice period starts the day we process it. How long does processing take? You bring me everything today before noon. I'll have it processed by end of business." Michael checked his watch. It was 8:47 a.m. I'll be back in an hour. He went home and made copies of everything. The land deed, his driver's license, the mortgage documents showing the structure address. He filled out the form at his kitchen table, his handwriting neat and precise in every box. Reason for land use change. Property owner exercising rights per NC General Statute 1 to 44.1. He wasn't asking for permission. He was notifying them of his decision. By 10:15, he was back at the county office. The same clerk took his paperwork, checking each document with a thoroughness that Michael appreciated. This was someone who did things right, who understood that government work might be slow, but it had to be accurate. Everything looks in order, she said finally. I'll file this today. You'll get a notice in the mail confirming the filing date and the end of the contest period. If no one contests, you'll get a second notice giving you the 90-day window for structure removal. What if I remove the structure before the 90 days? That's your prerogative. The 90 days is a maximum, not a requirement. Once the contest period ends, the land is yours to do with as you see fit. She stamped the form 3 times, each thump of the stamp sounding final and official. Good luck with your property rights situation. Thank you. Michael drove home slowly, taking the long way around the lake. The water was choppy today, wind pushing small waves toward the shore. A few boats were out, probably fishing for the bass that grew fat and lazy in these waters. Normal people doing normal things, their lives uncomplicated by betrayal and revenge that didn't look like revenge at all. He parked in his usual spot and sat in the truck for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The house stood in front of him, solid and beautiful in his. At least, the shell of it was his. Everything inside, the furniture, the appliances, the 1,000 small things Amelia had chosen, that was all hers. He wanted none of it. The next 2 days were a blur of methodical work. Michael moved through the house like an engineer surveying a site, separating his life from the one he'd shared with Amelia. His clothes went into boxes. His books, his tools, his father's possessions. He worked room by room, floor by floor, taking only what belonged to him alone. In the garage, he found the old truck camper his father had used for fishing trips. It was weathered but still sound, and it fit in the bed of his F-250 perfectly. Michael loaded it with his belongings, packing everything with the same care he'd used for a long-term project. Each box was labeled. Each item had its place. Amelia's things he left untouched. Her clothes, her jewelry, her laptop and tablet, the expensive kitchen appliances she'd ordered from catalogs. He didn't hide anything or damage anything. He simply separated what was his from what was hers, a clean division that would have been impossible in a traditional divorce. By the evening of the second day, Michael stood in the empty workshop, looking at the space on the walls where his father's tools had hung. The pegboard showed their outlines like shadows, dust marking where each tool had rested for years. He'd loaded them all into the camper, wrapped carefully in old blankets to prevent damage. This was the hardest part, leaving the workshop itself. He'd built it the summer after his father died, needing a place to process grief and the fact that he was now in the world without his father's steady presence. The workshop had been that place, a refuge where he could work with his hands and feel, at least for a few hours, that his father was still there in the cut of the wood and the weight of the tools. But the workshop was attached to the house, built on the same foundation. It would have to go too. Michael turned off the lights and locked the door one last time. He had what he needed. The rest was just structure and sentiment had no place in what came next. Cooper Maddox appeared on the third afternoon, walking up the driveway with the casual confidence of a man who'd lived in Cedar Lake his entire life and knew everyone within 20 miles. He was 73, built like a fireplug, with white hair cut military short and a face that had seen too much sun and too many fires. Retired firefighter, volunteer EMT, and the unofficial mayor of their small corner of North Carolina. Michael, Cooper called out, raising a hand in greeting. Michael was in the driveway, organizing the last few boxes in the camper. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. Cooper, how are you? Can't complain. Well, I could, but Jean tells me no one wants to hear it. He stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes taking in the loaded truck, the boxes, the general air of someone preparing to leave. You heading somewhere? Change of plans, Michael said, keeping his voice casual. Need to relocate for a bit. Cooper nodded slowly, the kind of nod that said he was processing more than Michael was telling him. Heard about you and Amelia. Sorry about that. Marriage is hard, even when both people are trying. Michael felt something tighten in his chest, but his face stayed neutral. Yeah, it happens. It does. Cooper looked past Michael at the house. She planning to keep the place? That's still being determined. Uh-huh. Cooper scratched his jaw, a tell that meant he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. Look, I know it's none of my business, and you can tell me to mind my own if you want. But I've known you since you were a kid helping your dad build that pier. You're steady. You're solid. Whatever you're planning, I trust you're doing it right. Michael met his eyes. Cooper wasn't asking for details, wasn't prying. He was just offering what? Support? Understanding? The simple acknowledgement that Michael wasn't crazy for feeling whatever he was feeling. I appreciate that, Michael said quietly. If you need anything, and I mean anything, I'm right down the road. Day or night. You understand? I do. Cooper clapped him on the shoulder, a brief solid contact that somehow said more than words could. All right then. Take care of yourself, Michael. And remember, the best revenge is living well. He walked back down the driveway, hands in his pockets, whistling something that might have been a hymn or might have been an old country song. Michael watched him go, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. Cooper had been his father's friend, had helped pour the foundation for this house, had shown up at the funeral and said all the right things without making them sound empty. Good people existed. Michael just needed to remember that they existed outside his family, outside his marriage, in the quiet spaces where actions mattered more than words. He went back to work, loading the last of his essential items. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. He stood for a moment, looking at the house he'd built, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. No regrets. That was important. He'd built this place with love and hope and the belief that permanence mattered. Those things had been real at the time, and they'd produced something beautiful. But beauty built on betrayal had no foundation worth preserving. Michael went inside one last time, walking through empty rooms that echoed with his footsteps. He wasn't taking a final sentimental tour. He was checking his work, making sure he hadn't missed anything that belonged to him. The house was clean, organized, all of Amelia's possessions carefully left in place. When she returned, she'd find everything exactly where she'd left it, minus only Michael himself and the things that had been his before they'd ever met. In the master bedroom closet, he opened the hidden panel one more time. The safe was already in the camper, but he wanted to check the space itself, make sure there was nothing else tucked away and forgotten. His hand brushed against something in the back corner, paper folded thick. He pulled it out, opening it in the dim light from the bedroom. Blueprints. His original designs for the house, hand-drawn before he'd transferred them to CAD software for the permit office. He studied them, noting the changes he'd made during construction, the adaptations required by soil tests and material availability. Every line represented a decision, every notation a problem solved. And there, in the bottom right corner, a detail he'd forgotten he'd included, a notation about the foundation's vulnerability points, the places where careful stress could cause catastrophic failure if someone knew where to apply pressure. He'd included it as a safety warning to himself, a reminder to reinforce those areas during construction. He'd done that reinforcement, had over-engineered those points to ensure they'd never fail. But reinforcement could be reversed if you knew what you were doing. Michael folded the blueprints and added them to his collection. They weren't evidence of planning. They were just his original designs, perfectly legal to possess. But they were also a map to the house's structural weaknesses, a guide to exactly how the building could be brought down if necessary. If someone who understood engineering wanted to. If someone who'd built the house in the first place decided it was time for it to come down. He locked the house behind him for the last time, pocketing the key. The gesture felt symbolic. He still had legal access because his name was on the mortgage, but after tonight, he wouldn't be coming back. Not to live, not to visit, not to remember. Michael climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove to the cabin on the far side of Cedar Lake. His father had built it 40 years ago as a weekend retreat, a single-room structure with a loft and a stone fireplace that drew perfectly. Michael had maintained it over the years, keeping the roof sound and the windows sealed, treating it as a backup plan he'd never thought he'd need. He needed it now. The cabin was dark when he arrived, surrounded by pines that whispered in the wind. He unlocked the door, flipped on the generator, and watched as lights flickered to life inside. The space was small but sufficient: bed, kitchen area, bathroom, workspace. Everything a person needed and nothing they didn't. Michael unloaded the camper systematically, finding a place for each item. His father's tools went on hooks he'd installed years ago, their weight familiar and reassuring. His clothes in the small closet, his books on the shelf by the fireplace. By midnight, he was unpacked, and the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a forward operating base. This wasn't retreat. This was repositioning. He made coffee on the ancient percolator, the kind his father had always used, and sat at the small table by the window. From here, he could see across the lake, could just make out the lights of his house, Amelia's house, glowing in the distance. 29 days. That's how long the contest period would last. In 29 days, if no one challenged his land use notification, he'd have complete control over what happened to the structure sitting on his property. But Michael wasn't going to wait 29 days. He pulled out the blueprints, spreading them across the table, studying them in the light from the overhead lamp. The house was strong, built to last, but strength was just engineering. And engineering could be undone by someone who understood it better than anyone else. The foundation was poured in sections, each section designed to support specific load points. The sections were connected with rebar and expansion joints, but those connections were also stress points. If you loosened the soil around specific sections, if you temporarily removed support from key locations, if you understood exactly how the weight was distributed, the house wouldn't explode. It wouldn't collapse catastrophically. It would simply sink, settling into the earth as if the ground had decided it was tired of holding it up. A slow, controlled descent that would be impossible to stop once it started. And it would be completely legal. Michael drank his coffee, bitter and strong, and planned. Not with anger. Anger clouded judgment. Not with sadness. Sadness made you hesitate. He planned with the cold clarity of someone solving an engineering problem, each step logical and necessary. Amelia wanted him gone? He'd be gone, but he was taking the foundation with him. The work began before dawn on the fourth day, when the world was still dark and the lake was a black mirror reflecting stars. Michael moved quietly, methodically, a ghost in his own former life. He started with the perimeter of the foundation, using a hydraulic jack to lift specific points just enough to relieve pressure on the connections between sections. The process was delicate. Too much pressure, and he'd crack the concrete, leaving obvious evidence of tampering. Not enough, and the sections wouldn't separate properly. Michael worked by feel as much as by measurement, his hands understanding the language of concrete and rebar. He'd poured this foundation himself, had mixed the concrete to specific ratios, had placed each piece of rebar with care. Now he was systematically undoing that work, turning strength into weakness with surgical precision. The first jack placement was at the northeast corner, where the foundation bore the most weight from the second story. He positioned the jack carefully, pumped it slowly, feeling the resistance in the hydraulic fluid. The concrete groaned softly as it shifted, a sound like the earth settling after rain. He moved to the next point, southwest corner, repeating the process. Then the southeast. Then the northwest. Each lift was calculated, each adjustment measured. He was creating an uneven stress pattern, forcing the foundation to support weight it hadn't been designed to carry in this configuration. By the time the sun rose, he placed 12 jacks at strategic points around the foundation. From outside, nothing looked different. The jacks were hidden beneath the house, invisible unless you crawled under and knew exactly where to look. But the foundation was now carrying the house's weight in a way that couldn't be sustained. Michael drove back to the cabin as the morning light spread across the lake. He was covered in dirt and sweat, his hands scraped raw from working in tight spaces. He showered in the cabin's cramped bathroom, the hot water turning brown as it washed away the evidence of his night's work, then fell into bed and slept dreamlessly for 4 hours. When he woke, his phone showed 3 missed calls from his sister Lena and 2 text messages. "Michael, can we talk? I feel like there's been a misunderstanding. Please call me back. I'm worried about you." He deleted the messages without responding. Worry was easy. Loyalty was harder. She'd made her choice. Now she got to live with it. The second phase of the work happened that night. Michael returned to the house with a different set of tools: core drilling equipment, a portable water pump, and 50 feet of irrigation tubing. He worked beneath the house again, drilling careful holes through the foundation at key stress points. The holes were small, only 2 inches in diameter, but they were precisely placed. Each one penetrated through the concrete and into the compacted soil beneath. Once the holes were drilled, Michael inserted the irrigation tubing, running it from a central point to each penetration. Then he attached the water pump. The process was simple but devastatingly effective. Water under pressure would flow through the tubes and into the soil beneath the foundation. The clay-heavy earth that supported the house would turn to mud, losing its load-bearing capacity. The foundation would settle, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the soil liquefied. It was the same principle engineers used to test soil stability before construction. Michael was just applying it in reverse, destabilizing instead of evaluating. He set the pump's timer for 4 a.m., 3 days from now. That would give Amelia exactly enough time to return from Santorini, move back in with her new husband, and settle into the life she'd stolen from him. The pump would run for 6 hours, long enough to saturate the soil completely. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, the damage would be irreversible. Michael packed up his equipment and drove back to the cabin as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky. He felt calm, almost serene. This wasn't destruction for destruction's sake. This was reclamation. He was taking back the only thing that had ever truly been his, the land itself. The house was just something temporary that had sat on it for a while. The call from the county office came on the 6th day. Michael was on the cabin's porch, drinking coffee and watching a pair of ducks paddle across the lake when his phone rang. "Mr. Halden? This is Patricia from the Randolph County Land Records Office. I'm calling to inform you that your land use notification has been processed and entered into the public record. The 30-day contest period begins today. Thank you. I'm also required to inform you that we've notified First National Bank of your filing, as they hold the mortgage on the structure. They have the right to contest the notification." "I understand." And Patricia paused, and Michael could hear papers rustling. "I'm also required to inform you that we've attempted to notify any other parties with legal interest in the property. In this case, that would be Amelia Halden, listed as co-owner of the structure. However, we don't have a current contact for her. She's in Greece. Santorini. She'll be back in 3 days." "I see. Well, we'll send notification to the home address. If she doesn't receive it, that's not your responsibility. The law only requires good faith effort at notification." Michael thanked her and ended the call. So the bank knew, and Amelia would know soon. Neither of them could stop what was coming, but at least they'd been told. That satisfied the legal requirement and, more importantly, his own sense of fairness. He'd warned them. What they did with that warning was up to them. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended state, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Michael worked on small projects in the cabin, fixing a loose board on the porch, replacing the weather stripping around the windows, organizing his father's tools in the workshop space he was setting up in the corner. He didn't go near the house. There was no need. The pump was set, the timer programmed, everything ready. He just had to wait. On the evening of the 8th day, Michael's phone buzzed with a notification from his home security camera, the one he'd installed years ago to monitor the property when they traveled. He opened the app, watching as a shuttle van pulled into the driveway. The wedding party was home. Amelia stepped out first, laughing at something someone had said. She was wearing a white sundress and oversized sunglasses, her skin tan from the Greek sun. She looked happy, radiant, like someone who'd just had the best week of her life. Tate emerged next, his phone already out, recording everything. And here we are, back at home base, he said to the camera, his voice carrying that practiced enthusiasm he used in his videos. Got some big announcement coming soon, so make sure you're subscribed and... He stopped talking. Amelia had frozen, her smile disappearing as she looked at where the house should have been. Michael leaned closer to his phone screen, watching their reactions in real time. The rest of the wedding party emerged from the van. His mother, Lena, Harold, a few people he didn't recognize. They all stopped, staring at the empty lot where, 9 days ago, a beautiful craftsman-style house had stood. The lot wasn't completely empty. There was debris, of course, with scattered like bones, broken glass catching the late sunlight, pieces of drywall and insulation creating a shallow crater where the foundation had been. But it wasn't the violent destruction of a tornado or the black char of a fire. It just looked like the house had sunk, settled into the earth, and broken apart as it descended, swallowed by soil that had decided it was done holding things up. Amelia's voice cut through the evening air, sharp and panicked. What happened? What the hell happened? She pulled out her phone, probably calling 911. Michael could see her pacing, gesturing wildly with her free hand while she talked. Tate was still recording, his practiced smile replaced by confusion and something that looked almost like fear. Michael closed the app. He'd seen enough. He went inside the cabin, made himself dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, simple and satisfying, and ate while reading a book about timber framing he'd been meaning to get to for months. Outside, the light faded from the sky, stars emerging one by one. His phone buzzed repeatedly, calls from Lena, from Harold, from numbers he didn't recognize. He silenced it and kept reading. They'd be figuring it out now. The police would arrive, would see no signs of arson or explosives or vandalism. Maybe they'd bring in a structural engineer who would examine the debris and find evidence of soil liquefaction, hydraulic jack marks, the irrigation tubes. Or maybe they wouldn't look that closely. Sometimes houses just failed, foundations settled, things fell apart. Either way, there was nothing illegal about what Michael had done. He'd never damaged Amelia's property. Legally, the house had been sitting on his property without permission, and he'd exercised his right to remove it. The fact that he'd done it before the 30-day contest period ended was aggressive, sure, but not illegal. Landowner rights in North Carolina were absolute. By the time Michael finished his book and got ready for bed, the cabin was dark except for the small lamp by his chair. He stood at the window, looking across the lake toward where his old house had been. He could see lights over there, police flashers, probably, and work lights if they brought in equipment to assess the damage. He felt nothing but a cool, settling sense of completion, like finishing a difficult build, stepping back to examine the work and knowing it was done right. Tomorrow, they'd come looking for him. Tomorrow, there would be questions and accusations, and probably lawyers. But tonight, Michael Halden slept better than he had in months, in a cabin his father had built, on land that had always been his and always would be. The convoy arrived at the cabin around 10 the next morning. 3 cars, one of them a sheriff's cruiser. Michael was on the porch, working on a piece of maple he was turning into a cutting board. When they pulled up, he'd known they'd come. He'd been ready since dawn. Sheriff Tom Breslin emerged from the cruiser first, a man in his mid-50s with the careful, measured movements of someone who'd learned early that rushing led to mistakes. Michael had gone to school with his son, had helped Tom build a shed 5 years back. "Michael," Tom said, approaching the porch with his hands visible and empty. "Tom." Michael set down his carving knife, wiped the wood dust from his hands. "We need to talk about what happened at your property." "Amelia's property," Michael corrected. "The structure was jointly owned. The land was mine." Tom nodded slowly. "That's what I'm hearing. Mind if we sit and discuss this?" Michael gestured to the porch chairs. Tom climbed the steps and sat, his uniform creaking with the movement. Behind him, Amelia had emerged from the second car, along with Tate and a woman in a business suit who had lawyer written all over her. "Stay in the car," Tom called back to them. "I'll handle this." Amelia started to protest, but the lawyer put a hand on her arm, stopping her. They retreated slightly, but Amelia's glare could have cut through steel. Michael met her eyes for just a moment, then returned his attention to Tom. What happened to the house, Michael? Foundation failure. Soil liquefaction under the load-bearing sections. Happens sometimes, especially with clay-heavy earth and improper drainage. Michael's voice was calm, factual. I filed a land use notification with the county 8 days ago. The structure was sitting on my property without current authorization. You built that house. I did, with my own hands, over 15 years. And now it's gone. The structure is gone, Michael agreed. The land is still there. Still mine. Tom was quiet for a moment, studying Michael's face. The county engineer is looking at the site now. He says the collapse was consistent with hydraulic jack usage and intentional soil saturation. He found equipment marks under what's left of the foundation. Is there a question in there? Did you intentionally bring down that house? Michael met his eyes. I exercise my rights as a landowner to modify structures on my property. The house was never properly authorized to exist on that land. I should have required formal approval for myself as landowner before construction began, but I was young and didn't know better. Once I became aware of the legal situation, I took steps to correct it. That's lawyer talk, Michael. Did you or did you not intentionally destroy that house? I removed an unauthorized structure from my property using methods consistent with safe demolition practices. I ensured no one was in or near the structure when the removal occurred. I followed all applicable safety guidelines. And most importantly, I own the land. What happens on it is my decision. Tom leaned back in his chair. You know this is going to end up in court. Probably. Amelia's lawyer is already talking about filing charges. Criminal mischief, destruction of property, maybe even domestic terrorism. Michael allowed himself a small, cold smile. Domestic terrorism. For removing a structure from my own land. Her lawyer's reaching. But criminal mischief might stick, depending on how the judge sees it. Then we'll let a judge decide. I have full documentation of the land ownership, the mortgage situation, my legal right to control structures on my property. I'm happy to present it all in court. Tom sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. You used to be a reasonable man, Michael. I'm still reasonable. I'm just done being accommodating. There's a difference? There is. Michael gestured toward where Amelia stood beside the car, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling yet another lawyer. She took my family, my dignity, posted photos of her wedding to another man for everyone to see, then sent me a message telling me to be gone when she got back. She said once something's old, it's dead to her. So you buried what was old. I removed what was unwanted. She got what she asked for. Tom stood slowly, his knees popping with the movement. I need to ask you to come down to the station, answer some questions officially. Am I under arrest? Not yet, but Amelia's lawyer is pushing hard. Might make things easier if you come in voluntarily. Show you're cooperating. Michael considered this. I'll come in, but I'm calling my own lawyer first. Fair enough. Tom started down the porch steps, then turned back. For what it's worth, Michael, I'm sorry about how this all went down. Your dad was a good man. You were too. But this... He gestured vaguely toward the cars, toward Amelia, toward the mess of legal complications waiting to unfold. This is a hell of a way to handle it. What's the right way? Michael asked. Let her take everything, smile, and pretend betrayal doesn't deserve consequences. I don't know, but I know this is going to cost you time, money, maybe your freedom if the wrong judge decides you cross the line. Some costs are worth paying. Tom nodded once, a gesture that might have been respect or might have been pity. I'll see you at the station. Come in by 5, or I'll have to issue a warrant. Michael watched them leave, the convoy kicking up dust as it wound back down the gravel road. Amelia never looked back, too busy with her phone, her new husband hovering beside her like a confused shadow. When they were gone, Michael went inside and made the call he'd been preparing to make for days. The lawyer's name was Rebecca Strain, a property rights specialist he'd found through 3 hours of research and a dozen referrals. She'd handled cases involving land disputes, eminent domain challenges, and complex property law. She answered on the second ring. Rebecca Strain. Ms. Strain, my name is Michael Halden. I need representation for a property rights case that's likely to involve criminal charges. Tell me what happened. Michael told her, laying out the facts without embellishment or emotion. The land ownership, the marriage breakdown, the house removal, the legal filings. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end. That's one of the most aggressively legal property disputes I've ever heard, Rebecca said finally. You technically have the law on your side, but you're going to face a prosecutor who will argue intent to harm, malicious destruction, all kinds of angles to make this look like revenge rather than property rights. It was both. Don't say that in court. But there was something in her voice that might have been approval. Meet me at the sheriff's station at 4:30. Don't answer any questions without me present. Don't make any statements. Don't explain anything. Understood. And Michael, this is going to get expensive and ugly. Are you prepared for that? I am. Good. See you at 4:30. The interrogation room at the Randolph County Sheriff's Department was exactly what Michael expected. Gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs, a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. He sat with Rebecca on one side of the table, while Sheriff Breslin and Amelia's lawyer, whose name turned out to be Catherine Voss, sat on the other. Catherine was late 40s, sharp-featured, with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd won more cases than she'd lost. She started the questioning before Tom could, leaning forward with her hands folded on the table. Mr. Halden, you admit to destroying the house at 1847 Lakeview Road? Rebecca held up a hand. My client admits to removing an unauthorized structure from his property. The word destroying implies criminal intent, which we dispute. The structure was worth $400,000. It took 15 years to build, and your client brought it down in a matter of hours using equipment and expertise specifically designed to cause maximum damage. The structure was sitting on my client's land without proper authorization. North Carolina law is clear. Landowners have absolute right to determine what structures exist on their property. My client followed legal procedures by filing a land use notification with the county. A notification that started a 30-day contest period. Catherine shot back. He didn't wait 30 days. He took action within the contest window, which suggests he was trying to prevent any legal challenges. The 30-day period gives interested parties the right to contest. No one contested. Therefore, my client was free to act. No one had time to contest because he moved before anyone even knew about the notification. Rebecca smiled thinly. That's not my client's problem. The law requires notification, not waiting. If the interested parties, including your client, Mrs. Beringer, failed to monitor public records, that's their oversight. Tom Breslin cleared his throat. Let's set aside the legal technicalities for a moment. Michael, I want to ask you directly. Did you do this to hurt Amelia? Michael looked at Rebecca, who nodded permission to answer. I did this to reclaim my property, Michael said quietly. Amelia chose to leave our marriage. She chose to take my family with her to her wedding. She chose to send me a message saying once something's old, it's dead to her. I didn't hurt her. I simply removed something she'd made clear she no longer valued. The house had monetary value. The land had greater value, Michael interrupted. And the land was always mine. She could have bought it from me. She could have negotiated. She chose not to. She chose to assume she had rights she didn't actually have. Catherine's face reddened. This is textbook revenge. You were angry about the divorce, so you destroyed your shared property to hurt her. Correction, Rebecca interjected smoothly. He removed a structure from his property to exercise his legal rights. If Mrs. Beringer is emotionally hurt by that, it's unfortunate, but emotional harm isn't criminal. Destruction of property is criminal, not when it's your own property. The house was jointly owned. The house was jointly mortgaged, Rebecca corrected, but it sat on land solely owned by my client. Without land rights, the house ownership is effectively meaningless. You can't own a house without owning or leasing the ground beneath it. Catherine turned to Tom. Sheriff, surely you can see this is a criminal act dressed up in property law language. Tom looked uncomfortable, caught between the law he was supposed to enforce and the reality that Michael technically hadn't broken it. I can see it's complicated, and I can see it's going to end up in front of a judge. Michael, I'm not arresting you today, but I'm going to need you to stay local. No leaving the county without notifying us. I'm not going anywhere, Michael said. Catherine, I recommend you and your client file a civil suit if you want compensation. Criminal charges aren't going to stick here. Property rights are too clean. Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over. We'll see what a judge says about your client's property rights when they hear about the deliberate, calculated destruction of a family home. She left, the door closing hard behind her. Tom followed more slowly, pausing in the doorway. Michael, you're free to go, but watch yourself. This is a small town, and people are talking. When they were alone, Rebecca turned to Michael. That went better than expected. She's angry, which means she knows the law isn't on her side. She'll file civil, try to claim damages, but with the land ownership documentation, she doesn't have much ground to stand on. What happens next? She'll probably file for an emergency injunction. Try to claim the land itself should be considered marital property subject to divorce proceedings. We'll counter with a deed showing premarital ownership by your father and direct transfer to you. If we're lucky, this settles out of court. If not, we go to trial and let a judge decide. How long? 6 months, maybe a year. Depends on the court calendar and how aggressively she pushes. Can you handle that? Michael thought about the cabin, about the quiet mornings on the lake, about the pile of wood in his workshop waiting to be shaped into something useful. I can handle it. Good. I'll be in touch. Michael drove back to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the lake in shades of orange and purple. The water was still, perfect for the season. He parked and sat for a moment, just breathing, feeling the weight of the day settle into something manageable. His phone buzzed. A text from Lena. I don't understand what you did or why, but Mom is devastated. We all are. Was it really worth it? Michael typed a response, then deleted it. Then typed another and deleted that too. Finally, he settled on something simple. You chose your seats on the plane to Santorini. Live with that choice. He didn't wait for a response. He went inside, made dinner, and sat by the window as darkness fell. Across the lake, he could see lights where his old house used to be. Probably work lights as crews assess the damage. Maybe news crews if the story had gotten interesting enough. Let them assess. Let them speculate. Let them wonder what kind of man could build something beautiful and then tear it down without apparent regret. Michael knew what kind of man he was. The kind who remembered his father's words. Never let someone tell you what you're worth. Show them. He'd shown them. Now they had to live with what they'd seen. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal motions and counter-motions, depositions and document requests. Catherine Voss filed her emergency injunction, which was denied. She filed a civil suit claiming emotional damages, which was dismissed with prejudice. She tried to argue the land should be considered marital property, but the deed was clear, transferred to Michael before his marriage, held separately throughout. Every angle she tried hit the same wall. North Carolina property law was absolute about land rights. The local news picked up the story, of course. Local man destroys house after wife's affair was the headline on the Lake Norman Gazette. The article painted Michael as either a vindictive ex-husband or a property rights hero, depending on which quotes they emphasized. Michael didn't read the articles. He didn't watch the news segments. He focused on the work in front of him, building furniture in his workshop, repairing the cabin, living the life he should have been living all along. Cooper Maddox stopped by occasionally, usually with some excuse about borrowing tools or checking on something, but really just making sure Michael was okay. They'd sit on the porch, drinking coffee or beer, depending on the time of day, not talking much. Cooper never asked about the house, never pressed for explanations. Your dad would be proud, Cooper said once, completely out of nowhere. Of what? Destroying everything I built. Of you remembering what matters. Land lasts. Relationships come and go. But land, that's forever if you hold on to it right. Michael considered this. He gave me this land for a reason. He did. He knew you'd need it someday. Guess he was right. The civil case finally went to court on a cold morning in late November. Michael sat beside Rebecca in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and stale coffee. Amelia sat across the aisle with Tate and Catherine, looking smaller somehow, less certain. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Hollis, known for her no-nonsense approach and deep understanding of property law. She read through the case documents with a speed that suggested she'd already made up her mind before the hearing even started. Mrs. Beringer, Judge Hollis said, looking over her reading glasses at Amelia. You're claiming Mr. Halden wrongfully destroyed property you jointly owned? Yes, Your Honor. We built that house together over 15 years. He had no right to destroy it just because he was angry about our divorce. But you didn't build it together, did you? According to the construction records, Mr. Halden performed all the labor himself. You were listed as co-owner on the mortgage, but you contributed no actual construction work. I contributed financially. The financial contributions appear minimal. Mr. Halden paid for approximately 93% of materials and carried the entire mortgage payment himself throughout the marriage. Judge Hollis flipped a page. More importantly, the house sat on land Mr. Halden owned independently. Did you ever lease that land from him? We were married. I didn't think I needed to lease. That's your first mistake. In North Carolina, land ownership within marriage remains separate unless explicitly combined. Mr. Halden's land remained as throughout your marriage. You had no legal right to place or maintain a structure on his property without his ongoing permission. Catherine stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Beringer had a reasonable expectation that her marital home. Expectations aren't legal rights, counselor. Mr. Halden followed proper procedures by filing a land use notification. That notification started a contest period during which interested parties could challenge the action. No one challenged. Therefore, Mr. Halden was within his rights to proceed with structure removal. He didn't wait for the full 30 days. The law doesn't require waiting. It requires notification. That notification was provided. If Mrs. Beringer failed to monitor public records or respond in time, that's not Mr. Halden's responsibility. Judge Hollis set down the papers and fixed Amelia with a steady look. Mrs. Beringer, I understand you're hurt. Divorce is painful, and watching a home you lived in disappear must feel devastating. But hurt feelings don't override property law. Your ex-husband owned the land. He had every right to determine what structures existed on that land. The fact that he exercised that right in a way you find hurtful doesn't make it illegal. So he just gets away with this? Amelia's voice cracked. He destroys everything out of spite and faces no consequences? He faces the consequence of losing the house he built with his own hands. That's not nothing. But no, he doesn't face legal consequences for exercising his property rights. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Amelia sat frozen, her face pale. Tate tried to put an arm around her, but she shrugged him off, standing abruptly and walking out without looking back. Catherine gathered her papers with tight, angry movements. Rebecca turned to Michael, professional satisfaction written across her face. That's it. It's over. Over, Michael repeated, testing the word. She can't appeal this. The law is too clear. She might try to pursue other angles, but honestly, I think she's done. This was her best shot. Michael stood, shaking Rebecca's hand. Thank you. Thank you for being the easiest property rights case I've ever had. Textbook perfect documentation. She paused. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Legally speaking. Just legally? That's above my pay grade. But legally, you were flawless. Michael walked out of the courthouse into cold November air. The sky was gray, threatening rain. He climbed into his truck and sat for a moment, waiting to feel something, triumph, vindication, satisfaction. But all he felt was tired. He drove back to the cabin, taking the long way around the lake. When he passed the empty lot where his house had been, he saw that the debris had been cleared away. Just bare earth now, flat and brown, waiting for whatever came next. He didn't stop. He kept driving until he reached the cabin, parked, and walked down to the small dock his father had built. The water was choppy today, wind pushing small waves against the shore. The air smelled like coming rain and pine needles. Michael stood on the dock, looking out across the lake, and thought about his father's last words. Never let someone tell you what you're worth. Show them. He'd shown them. The question was whether he'd shown them something worth seeing. 6 months later, on a warm April morning, Michael stood on the same piece of land where his house had once been. The lot was empty except for the small wooden plaque he'd driven into the ground at its center. Old things survive storms. New things don't always make it through the first one. He'd carved the words himself, spending 3 evenings getting the letters perfect, the wood sealed and treated to last. It was cedar, naturally rot-resistant, chosen because cedar represented endurance. Cooper Maddox stood beside him, hands in his pockets, studying the plaque. That's one way to make a point. It's the only point that matters. You going to rebuild here? Sell the lot? Michael had thought about that question for months. The land was his, free and clear. The mortgage on the house had been settled through insurance. Not full value, but enough. He could build again if he wanted to. Could sell for a significant profit now that Cedar Lake was becoming trendy with remote workers looking for quiet places. Neither, Michael said. I'm going to let it rest. Let the grass grow back. Let the trees reclaim it if they want to. This land held something for a while, but that something is gone now. Better to let it be empty than to fill it with something that doesn't belong. Cooper nodded slowly. Your dad would understand that. I think so. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the wind move through the pines. In the distance, Michael could hear the sound of construction. Someone building a new house 2 lots over, the sound of saws and hammers familiar and almost comforting. His phone buzzed. A text from Lena. I want to talk. Please. I understand now why you did what you did. I'm sorry. Michael read it twice, then put the phone away without responding. Maybe someday he'd be ready for that conversation. Maybe someday the hurt would fade enough that forgiveness seemed possible. But not today. Today he was still remembering the photos from Santorini, the smiling faces of people who should have known better. He turned away from the empty lot, Cooper following. They walked back to their trucks in silence. You doing all right? Cooper asked, hand on his door handle. Getting there. That's all any of us can do. Michael drove back to the cabin, where a piece of walnut waited on his workbench. He was making a rocking chair, his first attempt at furniture that moved. The design was complicated, the joinery challenging, but he had time now. All the time in the world. He spent the afternoon working, his hands steady, his mind clear. The rhythmic sound of the tools, plane, chisel, sandpaper, became a kind of meditation. This was what he'd missed during the years of marriage, of trying to be what Amelia wanted instead of who he actually was. This quiet focus, this patient creation of something that would last. When the sun started setting, Michael put his tools away and walked down to the dock. He'd started doing this every evening, sitting at the edge of the water while the sky performed its daily transformation from blue to purple to black. Tonight, the water was perfectly still, reflecting the clouds like a mirror. A loon called from somewhere across the lake, its voice lonely but not sad, just present, existing in its own space without needing validation or company. Michael thought about Amelia, wondering where she was, whether she was happy with Tate, whether their relationship would survive now that the excitement of betrayal had faded into the mundane reality of daily life. He hoped she was happy in a distant, detached way. Not because he'd forgiven her, he hadn't, wouldn't, never would, but because her happiness or unhappiness had ceased to matter to him. She was someone who'd existed in his life for a while, like the house had existed on this land. And now both were gone, and the land remained, and he remained, and that was enough. His phone buzzed again. He almost ignored it, then saw it was Cooper. Jean made too much chili. Come over for dinner? Michael smiled, a real smile that felt almost foreign on his face. Be there in 20. He walked back to the cabin, locked it up, and drove the gravel road to Cooper's place. The lights were on inside, warm and inviting. Jean opened the door before he could knock, pulling him into a hug that smelled like cooking spices and laundry soap. There you are. We haven't seen you in weeks. I was starting to think you turned into a hermit. Just busy, Michael said. Too busy for friends? That's not how your daddy raised you. They ate dinner at Cooper's kitchen table, chili and cornbread and sweet tea, simple food that tasted like care. The conversation flowed around topics that mattered and topics that didn't, a comfortable mix that required no performance, no pretense. When Michael finally drove home that night, the cabin waiting for him in the dark, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Contentment, maybe. The sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. He sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders against the spring chill, and looked across the lake. No lights where his old house used to be. Just darkness and stars, and the endless quiet of land that had been there before him and would be there after. Michael had learned what his father tried to teach him, that strength wasn't about never bending, but about knowing when to walk away. He'd walked away from a marriage that was killing him slowly. He'd walked away from a family that chose betrayal over loyalty. He'd walked away from the house he'd built with his own hands. And in walking away, he'd found what had been there all along: the land, the cabin, the quiet life he'd been meant to live. He didn't forgive. He didn't forget. He simply reclaimed what was always his and built something new with it. Not a house this time, but a life. And that life, solitary and quiet and entirely his own, was more than enough. The wind picked up, moving through the pines with a sound like distant conversation. Michael pulled the blanket tighter and closed his eyes, listening. The land was speaking the way it always had. He just hadn't been quiet enough to hear it before. Now he heard it clearly. You belong here. You always have. Nothing else matters. Michael Halden, 47 years old, alone but not lonely, broken but not shattered, sat on his father's porch in his father's cabin on his father's land and finally understood what it meant to be home. Not the structure, not the people, just the ground beneath your feet and the knowledge that no one could take it from you unless you let them. And Michael would never let them again.